Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome for a second time my good friend, very well recognized name, Mr. Massimo Martinotti from Florida, USA. Massimo, welcome to the show.
Thank you so very much, Ashutosh, for having me for the second time.
Thank you. Massimo is the Chief Executive Officer of Starlight Effect. He's the former president of the Florida Film Producers Association, and in his own words, he's a story chaser. Today, we're going to speak about detrimental narrative. So, Massimo, my first question to you, can you define what is a detrimental narrative in the context of an organization?
Well, a narrative becomes detrimental when it fails to assist the organization in achieving its goals. Of course, every organization, just by the simple fact of having been created and existing, it has a narrative. I mean, every company in the world has a narrative. However, through our work with clients in many countries and many different sectors and categories, we have found out that at times their narrative, the narrative of our clients, when we begin working with them, simply offer no value at all to the company. However, in other cases, this narrative can become a major liability. They can present a significant drag, and they may even sabotage the organizational reputation. We have seen that over and over again. Based in our experience, we found out there are 8 different types of detrimental narratives that we encounter again and again in clients all around the world. Each one of these 8 types of detrimental narratives have, of course, very specific symptoms and very, very well defined causes. Often, organizations are aware of the symptoms. They recognize the symptom. We have very low brand recognition, or we are losing our market share. But they are not able to make the connection.
Right.
And realize that the real cause of those symptoms is a wrong narrative. And I must tell you that we have encountered these 8 types of negative or detrimental narratives in similar proportions among clients operating vastly different sectors, banking, consumer product, food, pharmaceutical, and all around the world, in many, many, many different countries.
Very interesting. Very interesting. And, you also have another term called a misaligned narrative. Tell me a little bit about misaligned narrative and what are its primary consequences?
Yes. Look, I always tell the same story. Many years ago, I used to go to a family doctor office. And in the waiting room, there were about 10 paintings of sunsets. Not very good, actually. I sometimes think that the doctor was a painter. And these 10 paintings were hanging on the walls. But they were all completely misaligned. Not lined up with each other, with the door frames, or anything else. It looked, in a way, pretty... I mean, that they have been hung by a bunch of different uncoordinated people. Or might be by just one person in different day without any plan.
Right.
It was pretty comic or ironic that the doctor who was supposed to accurately judge the alignment of my blood test results couldn't even see how crooked the picture of the walls were.
Interesting.
I cannot stand misaligned frames. I mean, it's something that
yeah, me too.
It's something that I have to stand up and some way
straighten it up. Yeah,
straighten up. But misalignment in narratives often arise when the vision of the leaders of the organizations fail to translate into effectively into a consistent narrative. What happens that there is a lot of confusion. People don't know the company purpose, identity, their goals. In the context of the organizational dynamics, misaligned narrative often arise due to a lack of cohesion among leaders. They don't share the same meanings, the same language, the same culture. It happened very often to us to speak with the leaders of an organization. And even if they use the same words, they don't share the same meanings.
Right.
For instance, sustainability. The 15 members of the leading team, probably if they share the same word, we talk a lot about sustainability. But what they are not able to share is the meaning. You ask what does sustainability means, 15 people, and you have 15 different answers.
Very well said.
This alignment sometimes also originates by power struggles. Sometimes also unbalanced roles, conflicting personalities, very different vision of the market. Also, often changing management or generational change, especially in family companies.
Right.
When the next generation comes in, it plays a role because there are different visions that are not aligned. And each one of the members of the leadership have a different vision and express this vision in different terms. And this is a chaos.
Well said.
The ramifications, well, are gigantic. There is a inconsistency in the messaging, mixed signals to the teams, confusion. There is also an inherent risk when narratives especially within the leadership team are completely misaligned, that the risk of different factions within the organization begin a fight to control the narrative grows.
Great response. Great response.
It's very, very complicated. So when we begin working with one of our clients, one of the first things we say is you need to fix and align your narrative. Because if we don't agree within the leadership team to manage the same narrative,
well said.
It will be possible to have a reasonable and coherent.
But Massimo, tell me, how do obsolete narratives develop, and what risks do they pose to organizations?
How narrative develop? Well, companies have narratives. Just by the mere fact of existing. Why they have a narrative? Because somebody created it, gave a name, imagine where the company was going, who its allies or enemy would be. So the narrative is there. Sometimes consciously, the leadership of the companies try to craft a logical and coherent narrative, but very often the narrative spring out of nowhere, and but after a certain amount of time, they begin to lead the decisions, and that's a problem that very often play against the company, against the reputation, and against the
well said. Well said. And what role does employee engagement play in perpetuating or challenging a detrimental narrative?
Yeah, of course, when it depends on the company, of course. But normally, employees have a huge importance in the building of the narrative. That's why we tend to recommend the company to, in a way, co-create their narratives with their employees.
Right.
Because it's the only way of getting good resources. There is no doubt that employees play a significant role in shaping the narrative of the organization. And they should indeed, they should be actively involved in the co-creation with SMS, as I mentioned.
Said. Well said.
But let me give an example of how important it is. And how you can manage it. A few weeks ago, we were working with one of our clients on the launch of a new narrative through a very massive ad campaign to be rolled out across all media and in the 5 countries where they operate. It's a bank. The campaign was supposed to utilize, of course, digital and traditional media, TV, press, all the numbers. The employees from the very beginning had a very fundamental role in the launch of the new narrative, because they not only were the protagonists of some of the TV commercials, but we worked with them to manage the release of the ad campaign. What we did is that the day of launch, more than 5,000 employees simultaneously, precisely at 1 p.m., published the first commercials of the campaign on their social media accounts. So the first wave of commercial were not broadcasted on air, but on the accounts of over 5,000 employees. So in this case, the employees were protagonists of the commercials, but they also were instrumental in the launch of the campaign. So in this case, the employees were, in a way, owners of the narrative. And they felt that way. And it was very successful, especially because a company like a bank, of course, need to have the employees on board on a specific narrative, because after all, you can launch the campaign you want, but clients go to the branch of the bank and they begin experiencing the narrative.
Right.
They interact with the employees. So putting the employees at the center of the narrative is fundamental.
Very interesting. And Massimo, tell me, how does the digital age influence the formation and perception of organizational narratives?
Yeah, that's true. Digital media and platform, of course, allow organization, to reach their audience. But also the interesting thing, in my opinion, is that the digital platforms, media, and even technology allow organization to co-create the narrative with their stakeholders. They are very useful tool to place the employees, clients, consumer, and the communities in the center of their narratives. Of course, there are dangers. Some of the most detrimental and dangerous narrative for companies are those that are not being created by the company itself, but by somebody else. For instance, at times, a specific company or organization, sometimes a category or an entire industry, and sometimes even the private sector are defined by a narrative which most likely is negative and malicious.
Right.
That have been created by some other entities, competitor, media groups, political groups, organizations. At times, these narratives are based on realities. But in other cases, they are entirely false or based on cliches, perceptions, half-truths. This is what we call the third-party narratives.
Right.
And they can spread quickly using digital platforms.
Very interesting.
And certain sector, for instance, mining companies, they, of course, they are defined by narratives created by somebody else for different reasons. In some cases, is because environmental issues, so environmental groups, etc. In some other cases, is more of a local problematic. For instance, in Mexico and in most of Latin America, the land is sacred.
Right.
For the original, for the native cultures. So mining, in a way, is a violation of the ground, of the land.
Right.
So sometimes the narratives come from different angles, from environmental perspective, but sometimes is more a spiritual problem. And the same happens, in the field of plastic and sugar, food, banks. There are many. So digital technology have great opportunities to put the stakeholder in the center of the narrative and co-create the narrative with them. But on the other hand, also can put the company in the position of having to fight third-party narratives that are not very good for them.
Well said. And what are some of the biggest challenges companies face when trying to correct a misaligned narrative?
Yeah, when you realize that you have misaligned narratives and you realize, and the symptoms are clear. The symptoms are that there is confusion, that there is mixed messaging. What we tend to recommend that that beginning from the leadership, they have to sit together and clarify the concepts and find a common narrative. At this purpose, I would like just, if you don't mind, go back to why how we think that a narrative organization has to be structured. Because I think it's important to realize that narratives not necessarily are unique. In a way, it's actually better for company to have different narratives, and explain why. And then I go back to the misaligned narrative. Well, working with clients across so many different sectors, we have realized a very unpleasant reality, truth. That organization not only tend to rely on negative or detrimental narrative without even knowing it, but also on oversimplified narrative that are unable to capture the essence, the complexity of organization, and the complexity of the market. So we see an opportunity to shift away from the singular, simplistic narrative and unleash the power of multiple narratives. So we put together a methodology that is designed to assist our client to replace the simplistic, unique, single story with 3 narratives. We believe that every organization needs 3 coordinated narratives.
Right.
The first one is a narrative we call offstage. It's a narrative that resides in the minds of the leadership or of the leaders of the organization. It's kind of a melting pot where the company identity is forged and amalgamated. It represents a space in perpetual movement and change and evolution, where dreams and shadows intertwine. The offstage narrative also is the bedrock upon which to build the other 2 narratives. Here is where easily narrative become misaligned.
Right.
And where the company has to intervene. Because you have 2 additional narratives that depend on this one. The second one is what we call the backstage narrative. It's probably the most overlooked of the 3 narratives. This the narrative that the organization share with the employees is the culture of the company.
Right.
Sometimes this narrative in company is usually managed by the talent management department, the human resources department, with very little involvement from the CEO and the leadership of the company. This is a huge mistake. Of course, for certain companies, it's easier than for others. For instance, if you are a IT company in Bangalore, probably your employees have briefly the same age. They come from the same schools, and it's they operate in the same facility.
Right.
It's easy. But think of a agro-industrial company, 20,000 employees. While some of these people work in a fancy office in the big city, others probably work in plantations, in remote locations. So establishing a cohesive narrative between all this kind of people is very difficult, but has to be done. And it has to be done before you move to the next narrative, which is the front stage narrative, which is the narrative visible for everyone in the world. But let me tell you something. How do you build these 3 narratives? What the process? So in business all around the world, most, if not all, frameworks are created from the Western perspective,
Right.
using Western concept and methods. When we, especially since we opened the office in India, we decided to take a completely different approach. Because that's the reason why we opened an office in India, because we think that India has an incredible richness of narratives.
Right.
So we believe that the real innovation happens when you bring together different cultures and different perspectives. So our team in India blended Indian concepts, some originated from Ayurveda, with Western theories, create a unique framework. For instance, we use to define narratives for our clients using the 5 Ayurvedic elements. And because these elements help us to give attributes to the 3 narratives of the company.
Yeah.
In these days, I'm actually reading your book, the 7 Chakra Management.
Thank you.
And reading it, actually, I was reading it on the plane coming here to Lima from Miami. I will finish reading it today, flying back home to Miami. And of course, there is a clear correlation between the 5 Ayurveda elements and the chakras. For instance, I don't know if I remember correctly, but the root chakra, you call Muladhara.
Yeah, Muladhara chakra.
Chakra correspond clearly to the earth element.
Correct.
While the sacral chakra correspond to the water element. So we work with that concept. Originally, this framework with this Indian culture ingredients was meant only to be used in the Indian market. But interesting, a few months later, our teams in the Americas began using it too. So we have been very successful in incorporating these Indian narrative elements into projects for clients in the US, Mexico, Colombia, now in Peru. And you know what happens? That they are proving extremely effective across many different countries and industries. So I think that this blending of different cultural elements based on narratives in different countries.
Very well said.
I think that gives us an opportunity to build a very more, more rich framework that help clients to understand where the problem is.
Correct.
And correct it. To visualize where their narratives are not working properly and intervene and correct. And one of the main problems, as we were mentioning, I go back to the misaligned narratives, is when the offstage narrative, the intimate narrative, the narrative of the leadership is confused.
Correct.
When you don't have that in place, you're not in a good place at all. All the other narratives will eventually fail.
Very well said. Massimo, I'm running out of time now. We've been speaking for almost half an hour. I could just keep on talking because you have so much knowledge about so many different subjects. And maybe we'll schedule another conversation for more detailed discussions on narratives. But thank you so much for speaking to me about detrimental narratives. We covered a lot of ground on different types of narratives and some of the challenges. And I'm amazed that you were also able to bring together Ayurveda and the 7 chakras. Thank you for speaking to me, and good luck.
Thank you so very much, Ashutosh. I hope I will meet you next time I go to India, which is probably in a month or 2.
I look forward to that. Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.